Before introducing Professor Jared Diamond, I just wanted to share with you a personal note. I was raised in Hong Kong. I was born to parents who were farmers in mainland China and who escaped communism, probably moved to Hong Kong illegally. I was born in Hong Kong, and so I feel that migration and sort of this crossing border, it's something that's not only in my family history, it's probably part of my DNA. And that's probably why, when I went to college in Hong Kong, I chose geography over law. To my family's surprise, and they asked me, how are you going to make a living with a geography degree? Well, I think I've turned out okay. No offense to my law colleagues, but geography, it's good, isn't it, Jared? And then when in college, I went study abroad in Japan and the Philippines. That was my first time flying, first time being away from this tiny little British colony. And that experience opened my eyes. And then I decided to also then go to the United States and all the way to Columbus, Ohio, to pursue my PhD at Ohio State University. And that opened my eyes even further. I remember, this was in 1985. I remember distinctly this experience walking into a Chinese restaurant, and I look at the food in front of me, and I was thinking, you call this dim sum? This is certainly not the kind of dim sum that you just had there. I finished my PhD, and then I joined UCLA, very privileged to join UCLA in 1989, and another culture shock from Ohio to California. Well, the dim sum in California, in Los Angeles in 1989 was still kind of lousy. But other than that, everything was different between California and Ohio. So that was, again, culture shock. But I really think that I've benefited from these shocks because I was challenged, I was pushed to learn, I was pushed to appreciate and accept and humbled. And, being able to really benefit from all these different experiences, I think helps me to advocate, to be a true believer in international education. So I really believe that the pursuit of international education, be it study abroad or pursuit of a foreign language, or taking classes that have global content, or simply developing a deep relationship with an international student, all these experiences, I think, can be so rewarding and enriching to our students. So I hope that with your help, we can make International Education Week a tradition at UCLA for many years to come. So let me turn my attention and my speech, this part of my speech, to introducing Jared Diamond. Before my formal introduction of his bio, let me share with you that I feel that Professor Jared Diamond is really the most generous, kind, and low-key rock star at UCLA. You might remember, Jared, that about a year ago, you invited me to have lunch in your office. And so I brought some sushi, and Jared then took out several clear plastic bags of dates, I believe, some nuts that I couldn't really name, and maybe some mandarin oranges, I think, some fruits. And then there was no space in his office, to put all those foods down. So we put all our lunches on a wooden chair, just like the one that you're sitting on. And that chair is probably 50 years old. And yes, Chancellor, the furniture in Bunch is pretty old. Yeah, I said it. Gotta say it. Gotta say it. How often can you say this to a chancellor, right? So Professor Jared Diamond is professor of geography and physiology at UCLA with a joint appointment in the departments of geography and environmental health sciences. He began his scientific career in physiology and expanded into evolutionary biology and biogeography. He has been elected to the National Academy of Sciences, Japan's Cosmo Prize, a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, and the Lewis Thomas Prize honoring the scientist as poet. Very unique. And that was presented by the Rockefeller University. Professor Diamond has published more than 600 articles and many, many books. And one of his books, Guns, Germs, and Steel, was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 1998. He serves as a director on the boards of both World Wildlife Fund and Conservation International, and he teaches courses at UCLA on past societies and their lessons for our future. We definitely want to learn lessons from the past. And he's a lifelong aficionado of foreign languages. He has learned 12 languages over the course of his lifetime. I think you're delivering your speech in English tonight. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jared Diamond.
It's a great pleasure to be here in association with UCLA's International Education Week, but it's a double pleasure because this occasion is also an anniversary for me. Namely, it's the anniversary of my being at UCLA for 50 years. I arrived at UCLA in September of 1966, and I'm now beginning my 51st year at UCLA. During that time, of course, there have been big changes at UCLA and big changes in California and in the US, especially around international issues. In the next 14 minutes, I'll tell you my experiences of three of those areas. First of all, our students going to study abroad. Secondly, foreign-born students coming to UCLA. And finally, international involvement in the US as a whole. Let's begin with students going abroad. Let me tell you my own experiences in this area. Until I graduated college, I had had only one trip overseas, but upon graduation, I moved to England and Germany for 4 years as an American student overseas getting my PhD. Since coming to UCLA, I've spent 4 sabbaticals abroad in Chile, in Australia, in Italy, and in Scotland. My field work continues to be in Indonesia and New Guinea, where I've made 30 trips totaling 4 years. There are many frequently discussed advantages of studying abroad, and all those advantages apply to me. My studies abroad have been the most vivid part of my life. My closest friends are the friends that I've met abroad and that I've known for 50 to 60 years and that I'm still in contact with. Other countries and other peoples really are different from the United States and from Americans. Italians and New Guineans and Finns really are different from Americans, mostly in wonderful ways. The experiences that you have in other countries, such as Germany, are very different from experiences that you could possibly have in the US. And if you're a student in another country, you'll experience yourself as a different person. You'll find that you're a different person. I found that I was a different person in Germany and in Britain and in Indonesia. So studying abroad is like a virtual reality game, but it's better than that. It's real, It's not just a game. So those are advantages of studying abroad. Those are the advantages that are regularly mentioned. I've experienced them all myself, and I can confirm that those advantages are real. But there's another advantage of study abroad, one that was never mentioned until 5 years ago, and even today it's rarely mentioned and little understood. It's a specific advantage of learning and hearing and reading and thinking in a foreign language. To help you appreciate this newly discovered advantage of dealing with foreign languages, I'd like to ask you all 2 questions and raise your hands. First, let me ask, who here either has a parent or grandparent who's now over 70, or has had a parent or grandparent who passed the age of 70? Could you raise your hands? Most of you. All right. Who here hopes yourself to live past age 70? Raise your hands, please. Anybody who raised their hands in response to either of those 2 questions will, I think, be interested in what I'm about to say, because your raising your hands to those 2 questions means that you have first-hand or second-hand experience of aging. And aging involves a big fear, the fear of Alzheimer's disease and other cognitive declines of older people. 20% of Americans who reach the age of 80 will develop Alzheimer's. The disease is unpreventable, it's uncurable, and until recently, there wasn't even any remedy for its symptoms. It's suggested, you read, that perhaps you can ward off or diminish the symptoms by playing Sudoku or crossword puzzles, but in fact, there's no evidence that Sudoku or crossword puzzles helps you ward off the symptoms of Alzheimer's. Now, though, within the last 6 years, there's been a long-term study in Toronto, Canada, at senior citizens' homes, where, naturally, there are some people who develop Alzheimer's, and the study has examined who is more likely and who is less likely to come down with the symptoms of Alzheimer's. In addition, when those senior citizens die, it's possible to carry out brain autopsies and to recognize the biological signs, the strands in the brain of Alzheimer's. It turns out that the only variable that predicts whether or not a senior citizen in the Toronto study will come down with symptoms of Alzheimer's is bilingualism. People who are bilingual, people who use 2 languages, get on the average 5 years of protection against Alzheimer's symptoms if they're going to come down with Alzheimer's at all. Or to put it another way, on autopsy, when one can recognize in the brain the physical manifestations of Alzheimer's, for a given level of physical manifestations, bilingual people have milder symptoms than do monolingual people. So the numbers are that on the average, if you're going to come down with the disease at all, being bilingual gives you 5 years of protection compared to being monolingual. On reflection, that's understandable because we're accustomed to the fact that if something goes wrong with another part of your body, the best thing to do is to exercise it. If you develop a problem in your shoulder, there are specific shoulder exercises. So what are specific exercises for the brain? The thing that the brain does most constantly, that our brains do most constantly, is to think and to listen and to talk. But we think and listen and talk using the rules of grammar and vocabularies, but different languages have different sets of rules. And therefore, if you're bilingual, within a fraction of a second, you have to be able to switch back and forth between the rules. For example, suppose that you are an Italian-Spanish bilingual. Suppose that you are fluent both in Italian and Spanish. And suppose you hear the word burro. If you're Italian-Spanish bilingual, you have to decide within a few milliseconds whether to apply the rules of Italian, in which burro means butter, or whether to apply the rules of Spanish, in which burro means donkey. But that's going on in a fraction of a second. And so if you're Italian-Spanish bilingual, that is going on constantly. If you're English anything bilingual, that's going on constantly. And it's going on all day long, all your waking time. Whether you're listening or whether you're talking, whether you're thinking, you're always having to go back and forth between the rules. You're exercising your brain. In contrast, if you play Sudoku, how many minutes, how many hours a day can you play Sudoku? Maybe a couple of hours max. But if you're bilingual, you're exercising your brain for your entire waking time. And therefore, those of you who study abroad and who keep up your second language, we now know that you're going to get a lifetime benefit that we don't know any other way of getting. So that's a newly appreciated advantage of study abroad, apart from all the other things that I mentioned that are well known. The second of the three international issues that I wanted to talk about is the reverse one of foreign-born people coming to the United States, either as exchange students, of whom there are many here and with whom I've talked this evening, or else as immigrants. Let me tell you about my first class at UCLA when I came here in 1966. My first class had 62 students. And of those 62 students at UCLA in 1966, 58 were white males, and 2 were white females, and 1 was an Asian woman, and 1 was an Asian man. But 50% of the citizens of California are women, and a substantial fraction of the citizens of California were and still are non-whites, which means that in 1966, UCLA was not investing in more than 2/3 of the population of the state of California. Now the UCLA student body is highly diverse. My own classes are 50% or more women. In my classes, there are large contingents every year from East Asia, from China, Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Cambodia. There are large contingents every year from India and neighboring countries. My classes always have contingents from the Middle East, from Europe, or Latin America. It's truly an international experience, in contrast to 1966. But immigration and ethnic diversity are controversial issues in the US today, and on reflection, that's really strange, because all Americans, without exception, are descendants of immigrants who came to the American continent within the last 14,000 years. Even Native Americans are descended from immigrants who arrived in 3 waves between 14,000 and 5,000 years ago. Until 14,000 years ago, there were no humans in the Americas. And so everybody in the Americas today is the descendant of an immigrant. Except for Native Americans arrived between 14 and 5,000 years ago. Everybody other than Native Americans arrived their ancestors arrived within the last 400 years, and most of us had our ancestors arriving within the last 130 years. Our current president has an African father. Our next president has a European wife. The majority of American Nobel Prize winners and National Academy members are either first-generation immigrants themselves, born overseas, they themselves immigrated to the US, or else they're the children of first-generation immigrants to the US. Why this overwhelming contribution of first- and second-generation immigrants to American Nobel Prize winners and National Academy members? Well, take any overseas country. Take Mexico, China, Syria, or any other overseas country, and imagine some way of dividing the country's population into 2 groups. One group is going to consist of the healthiest, youngest, most ambitious, most risk-taking, most willing to take new directions of the population of that country. And the other group into which you're going to divide the population consists of people without those characteristics. In effect, immigration is making that division of populations into two groups. People who decide to emigrate from a country, any country, are disproportionately young. The average immigrant from Mexico is 21 years old. They're disproportionately healthy. They have to be to manage to do it. They're disproportionately ambitious, risk-taking, and willing to try something new. For centuries, the U.S. has had the advantage of being made up of those people and their descendants. And so it's obvious why American Nobel Prize laureates and National Academy members tend to be immigrants and their children. It's because success in science and in economics and in literature requires the same qualities that are necessary for emigrating, namely qualities of ambition and of willingness to take risks and willingness to try something new and starting young. And it helps to be healthy, whether you're an immigrant or a Nobel Prize winner. And so, when you leave this event this evening, when next you go into a UCLA class, or when you go out across the courtyard and walk around and walk across the courtyard and just look at the faces that you're passing on the UCLA campus, you're going to see international diversity. And remind yourself as you're looking at the people that pass you after this event, remind yourself that you're looking at risk-taking immigrants and their children. Finally, let's move on from UCLA and California to the U.S. as a whole. The U.S. is protected on our east and west coasts by the oceans. We've never been invaded on either side. And on the north and south, we just have two non-threatening neighbors, Canada and Mexico. In contrast, Germany shares borders with 12 neighbors. China shares borders with 17 neighbors. And some of those neighbors of Germany and China are powerful and threatening. And so the U.S. was, and the U.S. could afford to be, isolationist until the Pearl Harbor attack of December 1941. Whereas Germany and Japan, it's always been obvious that they could never afford to be and never were isolationist. They've always had to think about the international context. Even after World War II, the U.S. has had substantial ignorance of and disregard for the international context. Geography departments, Cindy's and my department, geography departments in the U.S. went into a steep decline in the 1950s because geography seemed unimportant to Americans, and there was some reality to that. But geography departments never went into decline in Europe, where geography is always staring people in the face with those 12 neighbors of Germany and any other country. American secretaries of state several decades ago, illustrating this scorn for the international context. 30 or 40 years ago, American secretaries of state used to play the following game. They would ask themselves, what countries in the world are of lowest geopolitical significance to the United States, and in what countries is it clear that the United States is never going to have to send troops because they're so irrelevant to our interests? And common guesses 30 years ago by leaders in the State Department were that the countries geopolitically irrelevant to the United States, at the top of the list were Afghanistan, Somalia, and Iraq, because those are all poor countries. They're all remote. Afghanistan is landlocked. Iraq is nearly landlocked. And yet, those three countries are all ones into which American presidents in recent decades have seen the need to send American troops. In addition, since September 11th, 2001, it's clear that the U.S. is no longer isolated. We're no longer protected by the oceans. We're no longer protected by our two borders. We're now living in a globalized international world whose countries are all interconnected with each other by trade, by immigration, by terrorists, by military concerns, by global climate change, and by globally rising sea level. And so there's been an explosion of geography departments in the United States, and there's been an explosion of other international programs here at UCLA and elsewhere in the US because of cruel realities. Finally, some of you are already supporters of UCLA, and others of you are students and potential future supporters of UCLA. If California were a separate country, the California economy would be the 6th biggest national economy in the world. There are only 5 countries in the world with economies bigger than the economy of the state of California. The origins of that California powerhouse economy are the University of California and other California institutions of higher education. That's where our innovators and our business leaders graduated, or that's why they moved from other parts of the US or from other countries to California. And it's to the University of California and other institutions of higher learning that those business leaders look to hire their top employees. And it's also the University of California and other higher institutions of learning here that's where most California legislators graduated. But California legislators, as our chancellor reminded us tactfully, California legislators forget those facts when they appropriate the state budget each year. During my 50 years at UCLA, state support for the University of California budget has dropped from providing most of the budget to today providing only 40% of the budget. And the rest depends upon UC finding private donors. UCLA in particular is the leading public university in the United States at raising private support, and that's partly because we've got to do it, and partly because we are very effective at doing it. So tell your elected representatives from time to time your views about the funding of higher education. Whenever there's an election, ask the candidates their stance on funding higher education, regardless of whether you graduated UCLA years ago or whether you're still a student at UCLA and are going to graduate soon. Think of support for UCLA not as charity, but as an investment that you can make in selfish support for your own interests and for the interests of your children. And so I personally thank UCLA for the 50 wonderful years that I've enjoyed so far, and I look forward to many more years to come. Thank you.